Hello there, Internet, and welcome to my show. I am Bret. This is my channel, and I'm here every week on Thursdays. We just hit our 1 year of doing these shows every week. I think we might have missed 1 week around the holidays, but hey, who's counting, right? It's a year. Let's celebrate. Mic check 1, 2. Anyway, so here on the show today is me and just me. I got no guests. We're going to be talking about editors and editors focused on the DevOps role, right? So you're going to be editing a lot of YAML, some Docker files, maybe some TOML, stuff like that. And there's lots of options out there. I have two favorites. I want to hear about your favorites. So let's talk about the rules of the show. There aren't really any rules, but the rules are like, be nice and ask questions. There's a reason I'm live on YouTube, and that's because this is audience participation. So you get to ask questions. Now, even though we're talking about editors today, feel free to throw in any container-related question. And if I have a helpful answer, I will get to it. I think the first part of the show, I'm going to talk about editors just because I wanted to focus on that topic today. And I'm obsessed about always having the latest, best editors. So, there's a lot of them, and I tend to change often. But if you have other questions, if you're going through my courses and you have questions that you haven't been getting answered elsewhere, whether it's in the course Q&A or in the Slack chat that comes with all my courses, ask those here and I can talk about them. We can have a conversation over chat, and that's why I'm live. Otherwise, I would just do a bunch of pre-recorded boring stuff, and that would be like the rest of YouTube. So let's talk about editors. What should we talk about? My two favorite editors are Visual Studio Code and SpaceVim. So technically that is in Vim, a variant of Vim running in the background, but we'll get into all that. I say SpaceVim because it is kind of like a distribution of Vim that it makes it really easy to get started with Vim. And I've been using Vim for, over a decade. Probably dabbled in it 20 years ago and just didn't really use it as a main editor. When I was, doing the Linux only thing on my laptop before I got into Windows and Mac back in the late 90s. But Vim was around then, and you kind of had to use it because it was one of the few things you could use in a shell. So, but lately, the last couple of years, I have moved to SpaceVim because I just felt like there was too much work for me to keep my Vim up to date with all the packages I needed and all the new file formats I needed to work with. And quite frankly, if you're a DevOps person, you are probably working with more than one language, right? So your goal in any team of ops and dev people that are trying to get along and get things into production faster means that you're editing a lot of different things. And it's really hard with something like Vim in the past, because getting all your plugins in there was a lot of effort, and getting a new plugin for each time you open up a new type of file was a lot of work. So the nice thing is now we have these different distributions. I used to use one called SPF 13. That was a pretty good one, but it kind of fell off at being active. It wasn't as well supported as SpaceVim, and so I have moved to SpaceVim in the last couple of years, and I love it. There's obviously a lot to it, but we'll get into that in a minute. Let's check questions real quick and see if we have any questions off the top. Let's see. Any thoughts on the latest Kubernetes vulnerability? My only thought is that if your Kubernetes is public, which if you do it in a lot of the clouds by default it may be. And when I say public, I mean if your Kubernetes cluster has either the kubelet port or the API server ports, any of the HTTP ports, which that's how Kubernetes talks, right? Kubernetes nodes all talk over HTTP APIs. So if those are public ports, and in a lot of setups, like if you just went to DigitalOcean and set up a Kubernetes on your own, then it's probably public by default. Any of those are now denial of service attack, basically. They're vulnerable. And that's not the default of Kubernetes. That is just underlying libraries. And that came out either yesterday or today, this week, definitely. And basically, you got to update your Kubernetes. Now, if you are on someone else's Kubernetes, you have to wait for them to update it. I usually do recommend, if you're going to do Kubernetes, that you're using someone else's, meaning a distribution provided by someone else, not what we call vanilla Kubernetes, which means, installing it natively and doing it the hard way. So I recommend something else, right? Like Rancher, Docker Enterprise, a cloud-hosted one, AKS, DigitalOcean's Kubernetes, Azure's Kubernetes. Everybody's got one, right? So you're going to have to wait on them. But this gets to the point of your question, and it's really, your Kubernetes probably shouldn't be public. Like, I don't know why there would be a need for anyone's Kubernetes API endpoints to be public. You can set up, the simplest way is you just set up IP restrictions for your whatever machines or your network at your company so that only you can get to those ones in the cloud, right? Now, if you've got Kubernetes in a data center on your local machine, you're fine. It's not going to be vulnerable unless you're sort of doing things wrong. Like Docker Desktop, probably not an issue because it doesn't allow any of these ports to be public outside your machine. In fact, you can't you can't even easily talk to the Kubernetes API from your local machine without using the Docker tools. So it's secured by default. Anyway, so yes, Kubernetes every couple of months gets a vulnerability because it is new software, right? And it is open source. So the good open source has good vulnerabilities that come out. And when I say good, I mean like significant ones. So any solid open source work is going to have that. And so that's why if you're not building your clusters in a way to easily update them and replace them, which would be, I mean, if you're in an ops role, that's like job one, right? Like day one is what we call day one ops is when you install something. Day two ops is everything else you do for the rest of your life. So if you want to look at, podcast or blogs about the hard parts of operations in Kubernetes or in containers in general, search for day two something like day two Kubernetes or day two Docker. And you might find some hits on people talking about, what's it like to update applications in real time and not have them go down? What's it like updating your Kubernetes cluster to a new release and not taking down your apps? Like these are hard things to get right. And you should always practice that stuff before you go live. So good question. But my thoughts are, this is going to keep happening, especially since Kubernetes has so many eyeballs on it. But again, this one in particular has nothing to do with Kubernetes itself. It just has to do with Netflix found vulnerabilities in the Go language libraries for HTTP. So good question. I'm glad you brought it up because I forgot to mention it. Hello from the Netherlands. Hello. What tips would you have for setting up VS Code to work with Docker? I currently only have the Microsoft Docker extension installed. All right, so if you're talking pure Docker, and let's look at Visual Studio Code. All right, and before we get into this, if you don't have Visual Studio Code, you should go get it. Let me just say current application. Let's see what that does. All right. Visual Studio Code is a free editor from Microsoft. Hopefully, most of you have heard about this by now. It's a few years old, and you can just probably Google it, VS Code. So this is a completely free editor from the new Microsoft, and the only thing it has to do with Visual Studio is really just two things. One, the name, and that's really it. And the second one is that it comes with IntelliSense built in, a little bit of that thing that we have in Visual Studio that allows for intelligent code analysis and gives you, the pop-ups with, like it shows in the screenshot here, on when you're typing things out. It'll try to help you along with language, verbs and stuff like that. So the nice thing is that's all built in. The reason I like VS Code, even if you're not a developer, is because it comes out of the box with a lot of the things that you need as either an ops person or developer, or if you're doing anything in Git, like markdown files or readmes. This has all of that. It has spell check, it has markdown awareness, and a lot of the languages, it just works out of the box. And when I say works, I mean it colors the syntax so that it's easier for you to write. Now, I've had tons of editors in my career, right? I used to love Sublime, and Sublime's still a great tool. In fact, I think Sublime Text is actually still my fastest tool. So if I have to open up a 1 meg log file, which is huge, to an editor, and I don't want to just parse it at the command line, I will use Sublime Text. And that is free to try. If you use it significantly, I would recommend buying it. It's not that expensive, and it's really just a couple of people that develop it. And it's what used to be one main person, but I think he brought on someone else to help. And this one's been around for years, and people have loved it. In fact, I would say that this was one of the original best GUI editors for sort of general open source language work. And a lot of the things that Sublime did got passed into future editors. And so if I looked at my career and I went back 15 years, Sublime Text was, probably my replacement for way back in the day on Windows. You remember, it's still a relevant thing, but you remember Notepad 2? Or no, it was Notepad++. Sorry. So Notepad++ was this thing in the 90s. We had it way long ago, and people still use it. It's still a great tool, but it's really, at least the last time I looked at it, it was really came out of the box just as a notepad. It didn't really have language support. It wasn't a developer tool per se. And then Sublime came along, and out of the box, it was it was designed to be a developer's editor. So not a full IDE, but a light editor. And then they came out with something called Package Control, which was a third-party tool that you had to install. But what it did was it gave you a bunch of packages. So you could start downloading third-party stuff from anyone who was making it. So that was a long time ago. That was probably a good decade ago. And they've only had 3 major versions, and they're all essentially the same tool, but slowly adding features. But the challenge with that was it didn't have a package manager out of the box. It didn't support a lot of things out of the box. So you had to go find out what to add. And it wasn't even really the main developer that was managing all of that. They were just focused on the editor itself. So then maybe 7-8 years ago, something like that, we heard about Atom. I think it's Atom.io. So Atom was made by GitHub, and it was a really interesting thing that a company that was making a source control tool released an editor. And this was a really great tool too, because Sublime Text was good on, I think Sublime Text supported Windows, Mac, and Linux. So that was like the holy grail of editors, was one that could support all major OSs, right? Then Atom came out, and it was built using JavaScript and actually runs on Node. And they built something that the underlying component of Atom was called Electron. And so they built this framework or library for GUI tools. And then they built Atom. They actually released Atom first, and they said, hey, this is a great code editor, works great with GitHub. And then it got instant, a lot of the community just loved it, started adding all sorts of new third-party tools to it. And then they released the underlying part of it called Electron that essentially gave you a GUI that would allow you to make easy tools that worked across different OSs that needed a basic GUI. And now if you look at the ecosystem of tools on Mac and Windows, so many of them are built on Electron. In fact, on my machine, I probably have a good dozen apps that are built on that Electron that Atom was first designed with. And that includes Slack, the Slack app, if you've ever used it. Visual Studio Code uses it, and so many more tools. And there's probably a lot of tools on my machine that use it that I don't even realize they use it, because Electron is really just a underlying GUI framework. But it all uses JavaScript. It's all built in JavaScript. So the thing about Atom, though, was it came unopinionated, which means it kind of came basic with not a lot added in. And you had to go through the process of getting into their, they had a built-in package manager, and you had to go through there and find the things you wanted. And you had to build sort of custom lists of your favorite add-ons to really make it a full-fledged editor for development or for DevOps. Now, fast forward to, 3-4 years ago maybe, and basically Microsoft took the best parts of Atom, focused specifically on development, and said, hey, we're going to release a tool that's got more with it out of the box than Atom. So Visual Studio is bigger. It's got more in it. It's got more features than Atom, but it's designed for a specific purpose. It's mostly designed for development. But because developers nowadays have to deal with a lot of the DevOps stuff, it now means that when you get it, it supports YAML. It does syntax highlighting for a lot of types of common files. And Microsoft themselves started releasing plugins like the Docker plugin. So getting to your question on the Docker plugin, if you're looking at the editor, if you just install the editor, and again, this one works because it's running on Electron, it supports Mac, Windows, Linux. And I've used it on all three. As far as I can tell, everything I've used on all three works just fine. And it's got some really crazy features that I don't see really happening other places, especially with this ease of use. One of those we'll get to in a little bit if we have time is Live Share, which allows you to essentially sync your code with someone else and pair program over the internet in real time through a secure connection that has sort of a key that you have to have in order to get in there. And it's one of the easiest ways, if not the easiest way, to pair program. Now, both of you have to be using Visual Studio, but it's really great for helping someone with any file. Like it could be a Docker file, it doesn't have to be programming. It could be a Docker file, YAML file, a README file, and you could have multiple people in there working at the same time. So that's pretty neat. And you're not screen sharing, right? You're just sharing the files and the file changes underneath. It's basically Visual Studio Code, keeping track of where everyone's at in the file and allowing you to work together. And it's free. It's pretty great. But Microsoft built that. So I feel a little bit safer about doing that. And plus when you're using it, there's an escape key that basically kicks everyone off. So in case you have someone that's misbehaving. All right, so let's talk about plugins real quick. So what I should have done was give you a generic editor with nothing in it, but I didn't do that. So I'm just going to show you what I have installed. Now, the Docker one is what I would say the first thing you should do. In fact, the nice thing about Visual Studio Code, and I'm not sure that other editors do this. Actually, that's not true. I know that Sublime Text definitely does this. When you open up a certain file type, if there are extensions that would be helpful and they're sort of validated as being safe, the editor will recommend those to you to add. So when I open up a Docker file, it'll say, hey, you should try the Docker extension. When I open up a Python file, it says, hey, you should try the Python interpreter, stuff like that. And a lot of that's how I got these. It wasn't me spending all my days trying out different extensions. It was Visual Studio Code saying, hey, this tool will make this particular file better for the editor. So Docker 1, absolutely minimum. And the first thing you're going to care is that it's going to give you syntax highlighting for Docker files. And I believe also for Compose files. And it's more than just syntax highlighting. So if you open up, let's see, open up a Docker file. So if I came up here and I said node, let's see, it should, yeah. So it's showing me real-time results from Docker Hub, right? So this thing is queuing it's basically pinging the API of Docker Hub and pulling down images. So I could say like the long-term stable on Alpine, something like that, or just the latest if I didn't care. And I don't believe this works with other registries, although, hey, there might be an option inside this Docker plugin for you to add your other registries. So the other thing it does, besides all that cool syntax stuff inside of your Docker files, is it allows you to see containers on your machine. So this is talking to my local machine by default, and I'm running on a Mac, so Docker Desktop. And it lets me see containers, images. If I want to manually connect to other registries, I can here. I've actually not used this that I recall, but it would potentially allow me to interact with that. I don't have any networks, it seems, or the networks isn't listed, so that's there. So that's like 101. You should just get that, and you'll discover the features. And of course, all these extensions, all the good ones at least. Let's go down here. have good documentation. So when you go into your extensions and you click on one, you'll be able to scroll down, and it should have, I don't know why mine says preview, but I've been using it for years. I don't know why it's preview. But it'll give you basically all the different features of this tool, right? And if you're in Visual Studio Code, you have this pull-down box, basically. It's like an intelligent command prompt in the editor. I'm trying to remember what they call it. What's the word they use? Yeah, I can't remember what they call it. Anyway, it's they have the same thing in Sublime Text and the other editors, like what's the other editor I just launched? Like GitHub's. I'm blanking on it. Like GitHub's Atom. So all of these have a sort of interpreter for different commands, and what this means is, if you're a fan of the keyboard, you don't have to leave the keyboard to do things in the editor. So on a Mac, it's Shift Command P, and this allows me to do everything. I can change preferences, I can run commands. So when you install the Docker extension, you get Docker commands here, and you can just do Docker and see how I've recently used Docker Compose up, Docker Compose down from here. This means I can stay in my editor and not have to run to the shell real quick. Now, a lot of these editors come with a shell feature built in, so you can, inside your editor, if you really don't want to have separate windows, I prefer to have separate windows. I like to Alt-Tab essentially back and forth, or Command-Tab back and forth between my different windows. Some people like all their stuff in one. It's just a preference. And so if you're in a file, you can start a new terminal, and it will bring it down here at the bottom. Now, in my case, it's pulling my default shell theme and all that stuff. So I'm using ZSH. So it'll look a little different for you based on what your shell default is for your login, and whether it's Bash or ZSH. And you can have multiple shells in here, and there's all kinds of stuff, right? So I can do my Docker stuff, and you'll notice that it's in the directory that my code is in. So that all works. Yeah, command palette. Thank you, Robert. It's the command palette is that pull down. I couldn't remember the word for that. Yeah, so, and as you add extensions, these will give you more and more features. And the way you want to search for something, you just like, hey, I want to look for Docker commands, or maybe, hey, I need to change my theme. Theme. And it'll say, yeah, preference color themes. So I can go through and try different themes out that I have built in, stuff like that. Yeah, we're all from right there. So I don't have to go open up the settings interface and go through all that, right? So it's really handy. Learn how to use that command palette. I think that'll save you a lot of time. My goal is always to use the mouse less and keep my hands on the keyboard. That's more of a developer thing. But as you get, even if you're not a developer and you're more into operations, you're going to be spending a lot of time in the DevOps world in files. Like, it's not a lot of clicking. The goal of DevOps is automation, and that means you're going to be in files. You're going to be in YAML files and Docker files and Toml files and JSON files, stuff like that. And that means you need a good editor. So, all right, moving on. The Docker one is one of mine. Let's see. Let's go back to extensions. I'm just going to run through these real quick. So, I open up an Ansible file in an Ansible directory, and it recognizes that format and says, hey, would you like the extension for Ansible that gives me the syntax of what that is? Let me just close that terminal. And you'll notice, by the way, this is from Microsoft. So realize that just like browser plugins, editor plugins you need to have some sort of trust. Right? You shouldn't just go and blindly install things. This is how you get viruses. This is how people steal stuff. All these things in your editor aren't necessarily validated by Microsoft. So when I'm going and looking for one of these, the first thing I do is, okay, well, if it's from Microsoft, I'm going to trust it. I mean, the editor is from Microsoft. So if Microsoft's putting out the extensions, I'm going to trust them the same that I trust my editor. And of course, having the number of downloads and the stars helps with validation. It may not be the only thing you want to do, but it helps me validate that a 250,000 people have downloaded this tool, and that it's high enough stars that it's probably not. It's only rated by 7 people, so that's not a really popular one. But Beautify is a common. This is not necessarily a product, but Beautify you will find in other editors as well, and it helps for massaging your code. So if I get a file that is, the line endings and carriage returns aren't set up correctly, and this is important for readability, I will use Beautify to straighten all that out. And so they kind of show you, they might have a screenshot here. No, guess they don't. But if you Google Beautify, you will find that there's probably Beautify for Atom, maybe even for other stuff, maybe for Vim. And because I know I've used it in multiple places. And I eventually will always add this because I get a file from someone that is either minified or it's, all the spaces are taken out, and it's really hard for me to read even with wrapping the lines. So Beautify will take what sort of the defaults for that language and cause the file to look visually easy for editing, right? So if it's a JSON file, it will break it all up so that it has the right indentation and all that, because you don't necessarily have to have that in JSON. And so you might get a minified file that doesn't have that. This is common when you download files from like websites and you're looking at CSS, maybe, or HTML. So maybe if you're a web programmer, this is going to be common for you. I added C# only not because I'm a C# developer, but because I was on a project where C# is needed. And as a DevOps person, you often will need to open up a few of the files for these apps that you're basically responsible for deploying, right? So one good thing that I recommend to junior people who are doing DevOps is learn the basics of each language. And I don't mean learn necessarily how to program in the language, but it's important that you understand for language and frameworks where configuration is always held, right? What's the conventional way for holding configuration values? For example, Laravel, right? If you're in PHP world, you probably know of Laravel. That has its own conventions for where to store configurations, like the database username and password, stuff like that. So if you're exclusively an operator or someone who's just doing a DevOps role and you're not one of the programmers, those are the things you need to learn. You need to basically learn the basics of where PHP stores its configuration settings, which is PHP INI. If you have to deal with Node apps, you probably should learn a little bit about the package.json file, because that's where all of Node apps configurations are normally stored. So you do this long enough, and you have basically experienced every major language and where to store stuff. So I'm sure that I had a project sometime that said, hey, you've opened up a C# file. Would you like to download the extension? And to at least make it easier for me to read, because the syntax highlighting to me is like one of the most important things for readability. So this would give me the syntax highlighting, right? CloudFormation, if you're someone who's on AWS, this will give you CloudFormation syntax awareness, and it might even give you drop downs for different things. Some of these give you examples visually. But if you're using JSON or YAML, this will help you in CloudFormation editing or creation, stuff like that. Let's see. Chrome debugger is just for connecting to Chrome and working on a debugger, using Chrome as your debugger a little bit. I add in some Git history one so that I would have some Git options more in my command palette. And I don't know that I use this one a lot. It's very popular, but one of the other things that it does visually is it allows me to see, I think it's the one that allows me to see changes, or maybe it's just this. Okay, this isn't the one for changes. This one shows me basically the Git log inside my editor. So, and I'm thinking I'm not sure if there's another GitHub one or Git. Anyway, if you don't see it right out of the box, if you're in an editor that, if you're in here and you're in a file and you change something, see that little green line? I'm pointing at my screen like you can see that. See that little green line? That is, I believe the default out of the box is that the editor will understand that this is a new line that hasn't been committed in Git. So you can notice down at the bottom, by the way, it knows what Git branch I'm on. So that, and I believe that, again, I think that's built out of the box because I don't see an extra extension there. Let me know in chat if you think it's an extension, but I don't see one there for Git. So it looks like I have Git history, and that's about it. So yeah, so I think that comes out of the box. So a benefit of VS Code there is that it understands Git and will give you those basic features of Git that you wouldn't necessarily get. You wouldn't achieve unless you had them. Someone's Biker's mentioning Git Lens. Not sure what that one does. So if you want, throw in the chat as an extension there. Go language. So a lot of these are just language helpers, right? Go language. This one's officially from Microsoft. JS Hint is something that allows me to run a linter. So there's JS Lint and there's JS Hint. I use JS Hint. And that allows me to run a linter to ensure my code is following standard conventions for the language. For JavaScript. Now there's the Kubernetes one, which I don't know a lot about. Quite frankly, I haven't done a lot of Kubernetes deployment stuff in my editor, so I'm not exactly sure. I probably have it here for syntax highlighting in deployment files, right? So if you're doing anything in Kubernetes, you probably are doing that in YAML, and because kind of like Swarm stacks, everything is YAML in Kubernetes, especially for production. Maybe not for local testing, but when you're in production, you're doing everything with YAML. And so this one probably gives me some kube commands in the command palette. Yep. So I can do stuff like that inside here that I didn't have before, right? And that's going to come in from the extension. And live share is the other really good one. Now, if you're in a team or if you have someone that you're learning with or working with, Microsoft's live share is a great tool. There's tons of examples. You can go on YouTube and search for how people use it. But essentially, I don't know if it has it doesn't have a GUI necessarily, but it even shows you the step-by-step going on here. I did with a friend, Kevin Griffin, we did do a live show on Twitch a couple months back where we showed off live sharing, but I'm sure that's fallen off Twitch by now and I didn't save it. So this one, in essence, will use a web server on the internet to act as a mediary between you and someone else, and intermediary that will connect the two of you together through a secure key, encrypted, so that because you don't want anyone just controlling this, and it essentially syncs the code back and forth so that they can work with you on your code remotely without you both having to have the code on your machine. It's pretty cool. So you think of it as like having one person with their own repo, and then you're going to have someone else with Visual Studio Code connect in and talk to you, basically see what you're seeing and look at the file you're currently looking at. And you can control some of those settings, like can they open up any file in this directory? Can they only see the file that I'm currently working on? Stuff like that. And then it allows you both to edit and work in real time. And they can even, I believe, run a server to run the code live on their end, as well as you doing it on yours. So it's pretty fancy. It's way more advanced than I thought it was when I first started trying it. All right, so the other couple of things I just want to mention is I do tend to throw in a couple of markdown things, because if you are someone involved in Git, you're eventually going to deal with markdown files like README markdowns, .md files. And I use linters, I use shortcuts because I'm constantly writing my documentation in markdown format. And so I'm not saying these are the best ones. I just have a couple here. Robert's saying live share audio. I didn't know about that. Ooh, that's pretty cool. So there must be a live share extension, live share chat, live share audio. Look at that. So, and this one's from Microsoft. So this is pretty cool. Set up an audio call directly from encode without using a separate tool. So typically when I'm developing with someone else or working on a file with someone else, we've already got a window open in Zoom or Slack or Skype or Google, Meet or whatever it's called now, Google Hangouts. So I'm usually in one of those already. But this is a pretty neat alternative, I guess, if you didn't want to have to bother with that. That's pretty cool. Thanks. And then, so the last couple extensions, I'm going to get to the questions in a minute. So we'll go through your questions. I just want to get to the bottom of this. So I add some more YAML support in here, and I'm not sure exactly why I did this. This may add more YAML features. It sounds like it's got Kubernetes features built in it as well. So this is from Red Hat. They run OpenShift, right? So they now, I think, hire a lot of the Kubernetes developers. So their invested interest is in, like, people having access to good Kubernetes tools. So I added this one. Not sure why I added it, but there's some examples here that show you what they can do. Someone's handwriting a YAML for Kubernetes, it looks like. So that's pretty cool. The last one, though, I want to mention is, if you are a Vim fan, we'll get to a Vim in a minute, but if you're a Vim fan, I like to Vim everything. So what I mean by that is that if you're someone who's learned some of the basic, and I mean just the basics of Vim, moving around a Vim file, right? A file in Vim, right? If you've learned the right hand keys for moving around, even just that, if you would like that experience in other editors that aren't Vim, or even in your browser, where you would like to scroll up and down the page with, JK and doing stuff like without leaving your keyboard, you can do that. And so over the years, I have adopted lots of Vim plugins for other editors, for Chrome, and it basically allows you just to stay on your keyboard using the Vim keys that you are used to in everything else you do. And if you just start looking for Vim plugins and stuff, like, you'll probably find Vim plugins for everything. I probably have 5 other programs that I need to put Vim into just so that I can Vim all things all day long. And what that does in here is, if I'm in a Docker file, and you'll see down at the bottom, now that I have this Vim plugin, you see how it says normal. So if you're a Vim person, you know that there's 3 modes at least 3 modes in Vim. And so I can move around the file. I'm not using my up-down keys. I'm using JK right now, and I'm moving up and down the file. And then if I want to get into writing mode, I would hit I to insert, and you'll notice that down at the bottom, it now says I'm in insert mode. And if I were to hit escape, then I go back to normal mode. And then if I highlight, I go to visual mode. So these are the 3 standard modes that most people are interacting with in Vim. And that plugin allows me to do that in Visual Studio Code. Because once you're used to doing stuff at Vim at the command line, if that becomes your thing, trying to use a visual editor gets very frustrating, because you're so used to using your keyboard keys that going to using the arrow keys or your mouse to do stuff gets pretty dicey, pretty frustrating. The cool thing about doing this in here is that I can disable it, right? I can go in, if I don't feel like it today, I can just go in and quickly disable the extension if I just want regular editing and not have to have the Vim. And then the other thing this allows me to do is I can use regular shortcut keys. Like if I wanted to use, Command C to copy in Mac, I could still do that, or I could use yank in Vim, like a Y key to yank it out. I can use either or, and it just works. And then I can paste with either the Vim key or with the Mac key, or Windows keys. And so it gives you that flexibility that if you want to be in Vim, you can, but if you forget and you're using regular shortcut keys, it will be forgiving. So that's true. I think I've tried it in Atom. I think I've pretty much done it in Sublime Text and every other editor. And if you're into Chrome extensions, go look up a Chrome extension, Vim something. I just look up Vim and look for the most popular one. I don't use it currently, but for years and years, when I was spending way more time at the keyboard, when I was on large projects where all I was doing was editing files all day, when I would go to my browser, I would want to use the JK to scroll up and down. If I wanted to, I don't think I used the I to insert or anything like that, but it had a lot of neat little utilities. You could search the page by hitting your search parameters that you would do in Vim. It worked really great. All right, so let's go to the questions. Let's see if I got any good questions so far. I know I've been talking for a while. So that's a long answer to the question on VS Code and Docker. Sort of curious. Let's see. Sort of curious about what you think about the traefik API vulnerability, but since I'm not planning on having it active in prod, so I don't know about a traefik API vulnerability. So I think I was talking with someone at traefik recently, and they asked me about it. I wasn't aware. I don't expose my traefik APIs to the internet, so Traefik APIs, just like Kubernetes APIs or Docker APIs, those should not be exposed ever. So, I mean, there's way too many ways to proxy connections in, or to limit via IPs, or to use SSH tunnels through a jump host, something like that. VPNs, I guess, would be an older way to do it. So there's way too many ways to do that. So I'm sorry, but I'm not keeping up on that. Let's see. Editors that support multiple code set displays. We did a lot of old databases and deal with the problem of double encoding SQL that is supposed to be UTF-8 but has been corrupted with Latin 1. Oof. Yeah, so I don't have any advice for that. I would say that every time I've had those kind of situations, the solution has always been different. And it's not common enough for me that I would know off the top of my head. The last time I probably had something like that was like 2016, like 2 or 3 years ago at least. So I'm not going to have any tips on that. I do experience people having issues similarly related to this with, they're on Windows and Mac and they have line feed and issues essentially. Visual Studio Code, I believe, helps with that versus other editors that maybe wouldn't. But if you know better, if someone knows a tip on that, give advice to Biker, because I'm not sure that I've run into it recently enough to remember any of the help on that. Yeah. Yeah. So, Biker, I would say one of the ones I might suggest is Sublime Text, just because it's been around so long and so many people have done so many different things with Sublime. It's also the best performing in terms of pure performance. I think it's even better than Vim. Of course, Vim's gotten a lot better now that we have NVim, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Vim is a little bit better performance, but Vim tends to, like, when you turn on just even syntax highlighting on really large files, Vim can get really bad. But whenever I have a really large file, I always open it up in Sublime and it works. The performance is killer out of the box. So I would check that one, just because whenever like newer cutting edge editors that really haven't worked out the long-term bugs, whenever they show up like Atom and Visual Studio Code, and you get these edge case kind of things like big files or encoding issues, I typically back up, go to older editors that have been around over a decade and that have dealt with that stuff and sort of added those features. So that would be my only suggestion. When you're done developing, would it be best practice to only use images that are inside your own Docker Hub, or would you do a simple build with only a from and then save it to your own Docker Hub? I'm not sure exactly what you're saying. I think what you're asking is, can you use official images as your base? Yes, absolutely. That's what everything I do is based on. I never build from scratch, but I don't just take an official image and then put it in my own for the sake of having it. What the reality is, though, is that you're going to end up, you're rarely going to be deploying raw upstream images from the official to your production. You're probably going to have to make some changes to those, whether it's, changing some configuration settings that maybe aren't built into their Docker file, or we just ran into this actually. Ray and I ran into this yesterday. We were working on something for Jenkins, and he needed to change something in Jenkins for Docker to work properly inside of the Jenkins agent, and basically we needed to change some permissions, I believe, and add a user or add a group, I think is what we had to do. Add a Docker group. And that wasn't in the official image. So we didn't just create our own image from scratch. We used theirs as the from, added our changes to ours, and then saved it obviously to our own Docker hubs. I think a lot of people, small teams, individual developers use Docker Hub to store their stuff. large teams that are cloud focused tend to eventually put all their stuff in their cloud hosted registry. So if you're on Azure or you're on AWS, using those cloud hosted registries, and that obviously the ones you build that you put in there are probably built from Docker Hub images, but they don't typically pull from Docker Hub. They pull from the cloud hoster mostly for two reasons. One, it tends to be faster, especially for larger images, right? Because it's in that cloud region usually. And then two, it tends to integrate better with the tools if you're heavily invested in that cloud, right? If you're in AWS and you're using a lot of their tools like Cloud Deploy, all the 1,000 tools that they have, those are going to have an easier time integrating with their own AWS registry. I'm not a huge fan of how AWS's registry constantly requires you to get a new key to get logged in, but it is what it is. And it keeps it secure at least. So it's a problem you have to work around with that one. But yeah, I don't necessarily just take like the default MySQL image and put it in my own to keep it. Because when you do that in a registry, you don't really have a copy of it, right? Registries they do what they call deduplication of storage. So if there's a layer in your image that is the exact same layer that someone else has, and the SHA key on that is the same, it won't upload your image or that layer of your image. It will use a pointer to the one that other person has. So technically, when you're doing stuff in Docker Hub or any registry, you're really not always uploading all the layers. Like if you have anything that was from another image at some point, it's going to use those layers that are already in the registry and not upload them. So adding it to your account doesn't really do anything. It's not like you're saving a copy of it for just in case. So I hope that helps. It's a great question. Biker's back with more encoding. For VS Code, what extension do you recommend for converting these double encodes? Yeah, I'm not gonna have an answer for you. Sorry, dude. I don't know. I think the most I've ever had to do in Visual Studio Code, besides line ending issues and the beautify that I talked about earlier, are like single to double quotes or improper quotes, and I just do that with find and replace. And you can do find and replace in files, and find and replace might support those UTF codes or whatever you're using there, whatever that code is called with the funkiness there, this little thing, and those international codes that we don't normally see in our coding files. Find and replace is kind of what I do, and it's lame, right? Yeah. How to back up settings and extensions. That's a good question. I don't know if I do that in, let me look. So this is a little bit off topic, but so we'll go fast because we're starting to run out of time. So the more you start using these kind of tools, you'll hear of something called a Dotfile. And so anything that is, especially a command line shell tool, it's going to be in the configuration of it's usually stored in your profile directory as dot something. And so dot files are usually saved for configurations. So I try to put everything in a subdirectory of my home directory, enlarge that, called Dotfiles. And if you Google around, you will find lots of people sharing their Dotfile setups. And so what I would recommend for you, because I don't know the quick top off my head what Visual Studio needs, what I would do is I would search the word Dotfiles Visual Studio Code. And that will probably lead you to people talking about how they save all that stuff. So what I do is I have this directory, has tons of stuff in it for all sorts of different programs. And I have specifically programmed those setups to save their settings file into here. And if that particular program doesn't support moving their settings file, then you symlink it. You create a symlink to point, like your .bash rc file, you put the symlink to point it to your home directory, and then you put the real file in here. Then you make this a Git repo, and then you save it privately to your GitHub or your Bitbucket account, right? The key is private. If you want later to make it public, that's great. But you need to know what you're doing, because sometimes these things have settings in them that are, maybe API keys or stuff like that. And you can see in mine, I save all sorts of stuff. I save SpaceVim, I save spell checkers, And I even have setup scripts for my Mac so that I can completely create a new Mac with a single script. All this stuff I didn't invent, right? I learned all this on the internet by Googling around Dotfiles, like, let's just do it. Dotfiles Visual Studio Code. So, and then there's a bunch of people talking about Dotfiles. So that's the keyword you want to use. And then if you just do, I think GitHub.files, you will find a place called dotfiles.github.io. And this is where my eyes widened, and I learned the magic of the Dotfile setup. One day I read somebody's blog, they mentioned this thing, I didn't know what it was about, and I clicked the link and it takes me here, and this is dotfiles.github.io. And if you scroll through it, it's all these default setups of people showing you how they save configurations of all their different programs, everything they can get their hands on. They save that into a single directory, and that way they can commit it to Git, and they can version it. So if they break something, they can roll back, right? And then they can also upload it for saving to GitHub as a private. And in this case, these people are all sharing theirs publicly. But you really need to know what you're doing before you do that. Because for me, for example, I do store sometimes some keys, some API keys for things I'm using regularly. I will store them in here, so I don't keep mine public. I keep it protected. But yeah, you can see in here everything from my command line colors to my iTerm setup. So in Mac, you have the terminal, which is what you're seeing here. It's called iTerm. It's a third-party one that I use. And it has its own settings file, and I save that in here as well, so that with a new Mac, I can just restore this. It all just works. And I even have an update script that will run all the different updates on my computer, like doing a Mac update, doing npm updates, updates my Sublime, not Sublime, my Vim editor, like all the different plugins for Vim and stuff like that. Even my shell, my omyzsh, which you probably heard me talk about that in my courses. I use omyzsh shell, and this will update that as well. So I'm not going to share it because all this stuff I basically just cut and pasted from searching on the internet. So, searching .files, omyzsh, or, omyzsh update, stuff like that will get you to all the things you need to do for that. And every program is going to have a different setup. So I hope that helps. That was a great question. All right, moving on. Can you suggest some best practices for authentication between microservices and containers? Okay, so the first thing I would say is if you are your frameworks that you're using probably will have a convention for how to do that. Wouldn't say that there is a Docker way to do it, but one of the things when you get to microservices and you start getting serious about microservices, so that you've got dozens and dozens of these microservices, you're going to want to start to invest in service mesh, which is becoming, and this is bleeding edge stuff. So don't go running out thinking that this is going to be easy and solve all your problems in a day. But service mesh is something that the industry has come up with as a term. And I'm just going to take it to my, let's see. All right, so there is a service mesh YouTube video that I just did a month ago with Betty from one of the service mesh companies and Solo.io. And we talk about what is service mesh, what it can do for you. And one of the features of these programs, and this is right now, this is really something that you would do if you were doing Kubernetes. There's not a whole lot of activity with service mesh in the Docker or Docker Swarm world. This is only if you were applying Kubernetes on top of it. But one of the things that service mesh is meant to do is help with authorization and control of your different containers to make sure that only the right containers can talk to certain other containers. It's not necessarily running that at the network policy level. It's more about service meshes put a proxy in front of each one of your microservices, and that it will measure performance. It'll track performance metrics, and it will help with control and authorization. So check that out. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in that area, so definitely go check that out before you make any decisions. But I think beyond that, it's going to be framework specific and certainly language specific to do that. You're welcome. You're welcome. Ultra edit. Biker likes ultra edit. Cool. Okay, so Vincent saying, when we talked about the conversation before on external images, the external image I pull from is deleted when going to production. I don't want that scenario. I honestly, if you're using official images, that's never happened to me. They don't delete official images as far as I know. So I never depend on first off, I don't use images from random people I don't know. I'm not saying that's what you do. I'm just saying that would be the place where I would expect those problems to happen. So it's an interesting problem you might have. I've not heard of people deleting those images if they're official images or if they're from a reputable company. Like if you're depending on their software and they delete an image, then shame on them. That's something they're not supposed to be doing. And I just don't see a lot of that in Docker Hub. So sorry you're having that problem, but that's a new one. Back to your discussion of using terminal. Using the terminal with VS Code, you mentioned preferring keyboard switching among many. Set the workbench action terminal focus and previous. Yeah, I'm not sure what that means. You mentioned preferring keyboard switching. Sorry, Charlie, I'm not sure what you're saying there. Moving on. Do I ever use the Docker file generators from the Docker extension? No, I don't. To be honest, there's a great place to start, right? Docker themselves are starting to get into this with their enterprise Docker desktop tool that they're helping you generate something called the application designer. They're generating Docker files, but those are always going to be a starter point, right? And by the time you're done, it's probably going to look quite different. And at this point, after I've been using Docker for over 5 years, I'm either creating it from scratch, but I'm almost certainly, for me, I'm creating it from a prior project, right? I'm using something that I already have to start something new. I'm rarely starting or using an example from documentation or something. So I don't see why you couldn't do it. I don't see there would be anything wrong with it, but I don't know anything about them in particular. I would say that bloated is not something you should worry about, though, when you're getting started. Bloated, to me, is, who doesn't have extra 100 meg of space on a server, right? So if there's extra things in your solution, there's always extra files, right? Every one of us has extra files in our Docker images that we don't use. The question is figuring out which ones you're not using and then testing without them, right? And we don't all need to do that all the time, right? Docker official images are constantly getting smaller because those teams are figuring out that there's files in those official images that aren't needed, so they just don't put them in. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I would say if you're not sure what to do, use the default generated ones and start from there. And then over time, get somebody that's with more experience in Docker to review them. If you're in my Docker Slack community, throw in your Docker files in there. Ask other people for opinions. Like that's exactly what that's for, is for you to be able to get feedback from other people that are there. Or just go to Reddit. If you haven't been to Reddit, the Reddit Docker group is fantastic. You can ask people for opinions, and you will certainly get lots of opinions there. Be wary that people might be a little critical, but that's okay, right? Like, we're all learning, and if you're on the internet for more than a couple of minutes, you're going to realize that not everybody's nice. So I would, if I wanted some real feedback, I'd throw something on Reddit, /r/Docker. So All right. Next question. I just bought your course, thank you, on Udemy, and I started development with Docker, and I'm looking for final stages. I mean, how I deploy my Docker development to my Windows Server 2016. I would say, so that's operation specific, and it depends on how you want to deploy. Are you going to use just plain Docker? Are you going to use Swarm? Are you going to use Kubernetes? Are you using Docker Enterprise? Which I would recommend if you're on Windows, because that's the most Docker Enterprise is the most mature production Windows Server management tool for containers right now that I've seen. Everyone else is catching up, and Docker and Microsoft have had a tight partnership for a long time now. And so Docker's tool was with Swarm was the first one to support Windows Server 2016. In fact, I believe, I don't even know that. So first off, I don't even think you can do Kubernetes on Server 2016 unless you're using Docker. Docker's Enterprise may support Kubernetes on Server 2016. You'll have to check that. What you really want to do, if you can, is use Server 2019, the latest version of Windows Server. It's going to have way better support for everything. Windows Server 2016 at this point is there's been technically 3 major versions since then, because they released like 1709, 1803 of Windows Server, and then they released Windows Server 2019 last fall, right? So 2016 at this point is pretty old, and it was the first version to even support basic Docker. So if that's the only thing you can use, then I would say try to use Swarm. And once you get done with my Docker Mastery course, consider taking my Docker Swarm Mastery course, because that focuses more on real-world cluster operations, like rotating out your containers and stuff like that. If your question is more on how do I do CI/CD, how do I test my images and deploy my images, that's not something I have in a course yet, but stay tuned, because that will be something that we make eventually. We want to make that course. We've just got to get this Kubernetes one out first. But really, you're just going to need to set up your CI/CD to build your images for you, test your code in those images, push them to a registry, and then have some sort of automation so that your CI solution can jump into your production server and pull the images from your registry and run them. That's essentially how every major continuous deployment workflow works. It may not be the CI solution that's jumping in the server. The server itself may have a tool that monitors the repo for new images, or you may just do it manually by jumping on a shell on the server and running, the pull commands and the run commands. But if you're doing production Docker on Windows, you should probably use an orchestrator. It's really hard nowadays to do sort of zero downtime deployments of Docker containers without an orchestrator. So you'll need to choose Windows or Swarm or Kubernetes. And Swarm is much more mature when it comes to Windows Server. It's been working with servers for years, and Kubernetes is now catching up. It just now in 2019, it just started getting. They're moving beyond the beta into official support, but that official support only works for Server 2019. So, great question. All right. Let's get a few more, and then I'm going to jump into some quick Vim before we go. Best practice for filling secrets and configs with the correct files or content. Copy files to production server and run some Docker commands, or do it locally and somehow remote add them. All right, so my goal is to never SSH into a remote server manually if I don't have to. And my goal is certainly to never download anything on that server, right? The way I look at a Docker cluster, whether it's Swarm or Kubernetes, is that server is there and I have all the tools I need on my local machine. It's just a question of getting those tools on my machine connected to the APIs on that server. So if you actually go to this URL, 1903.bretfisher.com. So 1903 was the latest release of Docker that just came out last month. And 1903.bretfisher.com will take you to no, it won't. Let me check that one. It was working. Oh, it's this. It's Docker Mastery. So 1903.dockermastery.com. if you go to that URL, it will take you to a playlist of 3-hour-long shows from this show last month. And one of the things we talk about there that you'll want to look at is the second day, the fast context switching. So when you see Marcos talk about, he's doing a bunch of stuff with the command line, he's going to show you ways to connect to remote servers with your local Docker commands, and you can do it with Kubernetes, on your machine and talk to remote servers. So that way, if you're using Docker or Swarm, because you're not specific on which orchestrator you're doing, but I'm assuming Swarm, because you're saying configs, not config maps. It's configs in Swarm, it's config maps in Kubernetes. So that's how I figured it out. If you're using Swarm, then you're going to want to use your local repo with all, and your local command line so that you don't have to worry about accidentally getting secrets stored in bash history or in any sort of logging on the server. So you do all this locally, and if you use his tips, basically your local shell will do an auto SSH to talk Docker to Docker, and it will use the SSH connection to that server to do so. So you don't have to set up TLS certificates and open up the Docker ports. So it's nice and secure. It's nice and easy. Check that out. Any thoughts on using Docker standalone registry server? My company wants to use a fully integrated registry to handle our images. You almost never want to use the vanilla registry. You're going to want to either use someone else's or buy one. So if you don't want to do a cloud-hosted registry, you can either buy Docker Enterprise, you can use GitLab, you can use in fact, if you look up, you can find a whole list of registries. Docker Awesome. So Veggiemonk has something called Awesome Docker. In fact, this is the proper URL. Awesome Docker will have a list of registries, and there's a lot of them. And you can find here these are going to be the popular ones. I think a very popular one is Quay. It's been around a long time, and they have a lot of features. So all these registries are going to have way more features than the built-in free, not built-in, but the free one from Docker. That one, to me, is more about for learning and for playing around with, but it's not easy to get authentication. It doesn't automatically do cleanup. It doesn't do image scanning for security. There's all sorts of things that your registry is going to need in real world business production that registry doesn't do. Now, some of those things you can make it do, but it's a lot of work. So unless you've got a bunch of free time, go get a third-party product. Not all of them are free. So, and it's possible that if you're a large enough shop, you already have a tool that can do registry. If you're someone who does GitLab, or if you already have JFrog Artifactory, which is for code storage, a lot of those tools have a container option built into them that can store your images. So check that out. But yeah, I probably would not, I don't know anyone that uses the registry, the vanilla upstream distribution registry, out of the box for real production use, because it's not fault tolerant. It's not secure out of the box. There's no GUI. You can, if you can't spend any money and you can't find any of those things there, the last option is Portus, port.us.org. It uses the distribution upstream registry, and this is made, who makes this? SUSE? Yeah. The SUSE team, a Linux distribution team, makes this, and it's really a full-featured wrapper around the open source Docker distribution, and it gives you the web GUI, it gives you multi-user authentication, and I don't know how it compares to the paid stuff, but if it was me, to me, the registry is one of the most important things in my infrastructure, especially once you start going containers. You're going to go everything containers eventually. So you need a long-term plan for how you're storing your code, which at this, it's one of the most important things for deployment, right? You can't update or deploy software. And in a lot of cases, if a server fails, it's going to need to pull those images to redeploy on a new server. So you can't technically even be highly available unless your registry is highly available, secure, backed up, monitored, all that stuff. And so that's where I just say, buy it. They're not hugely expensive. just go buy one. But I think all the vendors that make one that I've seen on that list are good, reputable products. And if you're using Docker Enterprise, you get it out of the box. If you're using GitLab, you get it out of the box. Yeah, stuff like that. Hope that helps. Good question. All right, so before we get to any more questions, I know, thank you, you all have more questions. I wanted to talk about Vim real quick because that was one of the topics that I wanted to talk about. All right, so SpaceVim. So Vim, we all probably have heard of it. If you're not using it, you've probably heard of it. It is, for a lot of us, it is very frustrating to use and to get started with because it's so different than everything else you've ever used. So one of the two things I want to recommend is how are you going to learn Vim, right? And the way that I recommend is playing a game. See if I have it in my... VIM Adventures. So this is a really great game that I use, and every once in a while I go back and play it again. I don't think I've paid for it. I probably should. It's only a few dollars, but it allows you to play a side-scrolling video game to learn the Vim commands, and it starts out super easy, and it goes. I don't make any money, but I should tell them that I'm constantly talking about their stuff on my podcast. But this allows you to learn the basics of Vim and the keyboards. And because it's hard when you just want to edit a file, and you don't know the commands, you don't want to use Vim because you don't even know how to use it. So like you wouldn't use it. It's frustrating to get started with. So I'd say take an hour, like block out some time, go try the first couple of levels for free. You can get pretty far in the game for free, and you learn all the basics around. Really, you could get by just knowing the keys that you learn for free in the Vim without having to pay for it with the VIM Adventures. But the next thing you're going to have to worry about is how, it's one thing to download Vim and get it on your machine, but that comes with nothing. It comes with nothing out of the box. So I recommend a distribution. Now, once you've had 10 years of Vim or whatever, or if you just really want to spend a whole week learning, you can customize your own Vim and tweak it by hand. But just like with the code editor with VS Code, I like it better than other tools because it comes with so much out of the box and it's just easier to get started. That's the same reason I love SpaceVim. And SpaceVim, you can even run SpaceVim in a container if you want to. Just look up SpaceVim Docker and Docker run or something. And this has great documentation. And what it is it's a whole bunch of add-ons and plugins for SpaceVim, or for Vim, in a single install. So it has a one-line install command, and it works on Mac, Linux, Windows, and it's the way that I've been using Vim for years now. And what you do is when you set it up, it can replace the standard command. So in my case, if I just do which Vim, you can see that I'm aliased to nvim. Now, nvim, what is nvim? Nvim is it's not a rewrite. It is a team that, because the original Vim project is really only maintained by one person, or that controls it. It's kind of like the Linux kernel. One person controls it. And the neovim is an attempt to add a bunch of modern functionality and features, especially around performance, to the Vim project. So it's technically a separate project that tracks Vim upstream. But at this point, a lot of us are choosing to use it as our default Vim. So normally you would have Vim and nvim on your machine. And if you're on a Mac, you can use brew to install nvim. If you're on Windows, they have all the different ways to install it. They'll tell you how to install it for your different OS. Right? And it works on all of them. If on Windows, you can try to use Chocolatey, which would be an easier way to do it on Windows. Chocolatey is a package manager for Windows. And that will get you the actual Vim editor. And then you would install SpaceVim, which will change the default configuration for how Vim starts up so that when you are, let's say in this directory, and I just type Vim, I get this. I get a nice little browser on the side with my file browser. I can, go down and open up a file. I get syntax highlighting. you'll notice that I have these bars on the top and bottom that have all sorts of information in them. That's not out of the box. Like all this stuff is coming with SpaceVim right out of the box. And you can change the themes pretty easily. And the documentation is really, really good. One of my favorite features is if I don't remember a command, I just hit the space bar. And the space bar then gives me this pop-up window. None of this comes out of the box with Vim. It gives me this pop-up window that allows me to decide what I want to do next, right? And it tells me, oh, if I want to open up files, I hit the F key. That's over here, right there. So I hit the F key. And then if I want to find files in my current directory, I would hit F again. So that's this menu item right there. And yeah, that's not going to work so it's popping up a menu to help me search for files. And then I can quit out of that. And then I can hit F, and then I want to basically hide the file menu. So I know if I'm going to do something with files, I hit the F key. And then if I wait just a second, it'll re-pop up this menu thinking, maybe you don't know what to hit next. Let me show you. So the pop-up menu I find is super helpful. Sometimes if you're just slow, it can be annoying because it's popping up when you're slow. But as soon as I hit the command I want, like in this case, the T for toggle my file tree, that file tree goes away. And then, next time I can hit F, spacebar FT, and it pops back. And again, if I hit the spacebar and then F and I'm not really sure what to hit next, it will then, I wait a second, it pops right back up. And you can change everything about it. Everything in here is customizable, and they have all the documentation on their website. So if you've been thinking about trying Vim, it's a really powerful editor. And the reason that I think it's so important in DevOps is because sometimes you will be on a server and you won't have Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code has plugins that allow you to even do things to remote servers. But more than not, you're going to be in a situation where you have to use Vim because it's the only thing on your machine. It's a server on Amazon. You don't want to install anything, but Vim's already there, or at least VI, right? Which is basically Vim. And that's going to be there, and you'll be able to use it to edit a file. I think that's a fundamental skill that we all have, at least if you learn how to get into a file, take something out of it, delete something, add something in, move around in a file. Those are the super basics. You just need to learn those basics. And once you know those, you'll be able to jump on any server and manipulate it, right? Obviously, there's something called Nano, which if you're really not wanting to do anything with Vim and you don't want to learn something else like Emacs, there is something called Nano. And Nano is on most Linux distributions, and it's arrow key friendly, and it has a menu, so you know which buttons to hit. So it's much more friendly as a backup plan. So back in the 90s, when I first got started in Linux, when it was really young, and Nano was actually on other Unix systems. It wasn't just on Linux systems. And I could use Nano because I didn't know Vim. But Nano gave me a nice little menu and showed me what to use. So, all right. That's it for all my tips. I hope you try one of those two out. Let me just scroll through the questions real quick. Sorry if I didn't get to everyone's today. Let's see. Vincent's asking about health checks. Let me see if I can do some rapid fire. Health checks. Should wait for availability of my Acme file and my volume before starting. Should I create a health check which checks that? If you're using rexray, rexray will not start the container until the storage is available. So I have not had that be a problem. At least nothing I've ever done has caused me to, basically rexray has to be there on the right server before it will allow the container to start. So in my case, no, you don't need a health check to check for a file. But that's not a bad idea for health check, just to make sure that it's there. But I haven't had to do that. Hey, Charlie, I'm seeing all your comments. Thank you. I will read those in a minute. Context deadline exceeded. My server gets really slow, but after a while, everything will be up and running. I think you're talking about Docker Compose, context deadline exceeded. Usually, to me, what that means is that you need more resources. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to burn and crash, but it usually means that the system is doing more than what it can do at a single time. So you might need more processors or more RAM or just faster disk. But depending on when you see that message, and that message is common in a lot of places. So it's not like you only get that in one place, right? So I don't really know the context of your error. to know whether or not that was a real concern. All right, so Docker to Docker recommendation is more Docker to Docker combination is more recommended for RabbitMQ, but what's your best choice? I don't really understand. I don't really understand that question. Sorry. I don't know why you would use it, RabbitMQ. I mean, RabbitMQ is just a messenger, a queuer, right? So yeah, it works fine in Docker. If that's your question, it doesn't have anything to do with running Docker necessarily. But why don't you use or like Nano? Because Vim is way more powerful, and Nano is designed basically for basic editing, at least in my experience. Nano is there if you need it, but I learned Vim, the basics of Vim, many years ago, and have stuck with it. And it's the ability for you to do all sorts of things with opening up multiple windows and having multiple views and all that stuff in Vim is pretty awesome. And it's where all the focus is now on making the best. I'm sure Emacs is getting that same level of love, but I started with Vim and I never moved to Emacs, so I stuck with Vim. And I would say that in most cases, when you see people doing stuff in their shell, they're using Vim, right? If you watch the container world and people are doing examples of stuff, if they're doing stuff, text editing in the shell, in my case, I've always only seen people using Vim. So the nice thing there is that you're going to see lots of people using it, lots of people that you can get help from and support from. And so that can be beneficial when you're learning something or trying something new. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for all the questions. They were great questions, and we will be back here next Thursday doing the same thing. I don't know if we're going to have a guest yet. Otherwise, I would announce it here so that you would know. But we're going to be doing the same sort of thing. So throw your ideas in chat for what you want the next topic to be, a topic that we can talk about for an hour. And you never know. It might be on next week or in the next couple of weeks on my YouTube Live. So thanks again for showing up, and I will see you next week on YouTube Live. Ciao.